As you can see, my background looks a little bit different today, and that's because I got kicked out of my room because apparently it was unsafe to inhabit. Which means all my command strips went to waste, and right now there's a blank background and a messy desk that I have not had time to clean. Now, the early 2000s and 2010s in television was a very interesting time span because it was the transition between a lot of the culture and elements that we saw in the late 90s from the 2000s to the 2010s. It was that awkward transition that just kind of took a long time to get right. But that also meant that the standard of content was a lot different back then than it was now. Which is kind of weird to say, considering that it's only been like, I don't know, like under a decade. But around that time, people were experimenting with things like fashion, music, and television cartoons. As well as what the threshold of what you could get away with was.
And approach the sausage.
But that just opened up a lot of creativity and ideas that we probably wouldn't see today. But some of the things that probably wouldn't fly entirely today, as it probably did back then, were things like the Boondocks, Clone High, the original, Moral Oral, and making Fiends, which is what we're talking about today. But also Invader Zim. I don't remember if I mentioned that earlier. I kind of drank some NyQuil mixed with lemon juice. Turns out that was a bad idea. But one thing that these all have in common is that, ironically, the things that made them stand out the most, that people loved for a while, or the reasons why they didn't gain that much of an audience to begin with, but did 20 minutes later, was what got them canceled. Which one thing was that they canceled Invader Zim because it got too dark, but to be fair, they literally hired the person that made Johnny the Homicide Maniac, and the spin-off Squee was what got him hired in the first place.
This is Editor L, and one thing that was clearly in the outline that I happened to miss was the other reason it got canceled. Which is, and I quote, "The ratings amongst Nickelodeon's core demographic were just not high enough for the network to justify the expenses being put into the show." In other words, if the kids don't appreciate it, then it gets taken off.
And the Boondocks also apparently got canceled, which I thought it was just because of a show thing, but people are saying that part of the reason for that was because of cultural insensitivity. But also, Clone High got canceled because of their portrayal for Gandhi, when the whole point was that the clones don't act at all like their clone fathers. Now, whether or not it was reasonable was up for debate, but it was an entire culture of a different country that was completely out of, like, control, so. At least out of our control, because it was a highly respected figure that they found, like, horrendously offensive. And Moral Oral got canceled for being too depressing, which I'm not sure what they were expecting. Honestly, I was kind of expecting it to get canceled on the touch of religion. But surprisingly, that wasn't. It was like one specific episode. But one thing that makes Making Fiends stand out is that there wasn't initially a clear reason it got canceled. I was doing a lot of research, and there was talk that apparently Amy Winfrey originally talked with the producers to air it on the main channel, so there could be more advertising and, you know, there'd be more of an audience. However, at the time, Nicktoons was also being made, and it was a little bit brand new, so there wasn't a lot of traction yet, and they decided the great idea would be to put this show on there. So unsurprisingly, there was little to no audience for it, didn't get a lot of traction, and didn't get much of a chance either. It didn't even make it past the first season, which Amy Winfrey openly commented about when they had the nerve to put him in the Hall of Creators. But it is important to mention because this show is actually really good. And it's definitely something that we probably would have, like, watch religiously if it came out like in this time period today. So the question would come up, why did I not hear about it if the show was like this? Which the answer is capitalism. And there's also a series of shorts that came with it as well. The premise of Making Fiends just kind of follows like two little girls, one of them making fiends, wanting to commit mass genocide on the entire city. This girl named Vendetta, who makes fiends and, you know, keeps an entire town in her control, even her own parents inside of a hamster cage. Until this one girl, Charlotte, who literally does not really care about anything that's going on, literally the happiest soul that you'll ever see, which wants to be friends with Vendetta. Vendetta is very annoyed by this and semi-put off, so she tries to destroy her all the time. But it always ends up backfiring in, like, not really the most expected ways. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. It definitely did get a little bit weirder as it went on, but not in the sense that you think. But one thing in particular about the disposition between Charlotte and Vendetta is that there was a theory going around that Charlotte was probably a fiend made by Vendetta that escaped a while ago. Either that, or she's horrifically delusioned into thinking that everything is, you know, completely fine. Which you would have that impression from the short we're going to be talking today, called Dear Pretty Diary and Dear Stupid Journal. Because what I think is that Charlotte knows exactly what she's doing, and she knows exactly what Vendetta's doing. Now, Charlotte is one of those characters that just seems very bright and sunny and a sunny disposition, which is a popular trope, but there are certain things that she does and behaviors that make you wonder just what makes her tick, which led to a lot of theories because the internet just can't accept that somebody can be happier than they are. But the short itself, the premise revolves around a story, the same day, the same events being told from two different perspectives, but they're also two different unreliable narrators. Vendetta seems to emphasize the terror that she feels and endures whenever Charlotte breaks in, whereas Charlotte kind of gives it off as some sort of a friendly bonding thing, completely disregarding any of the other cues or anything that would happen in response to her actions.
Then Vendetta wanted to play catch. Sometimes Vendetta couldn't catch because we were having so much fun!
I tried to drive her away. I threw things at her. But she did not leave. She threw everything back at me.
But because that it relies entirely on these unreliable narrators, the full story actually is never told. Sure, there are some things that are in both stories that you can infer happened, but the in-betweens as well as what they said or what they did kind of get obscured as it continues. But the short is very important if we're going to understand either character because it does give us a look into how they see things as well as how they may interpret or think of things. But the reason this episode in particular is very important is that there are certain details that once you watch it and you watch the series over again, you start to notice a few strange things as a result. Which, to be fair, goes with any episode in the series, as there is a sense of continuation between, you know, actions of the characters and events that took place. For example, Vendetta seems to progressively get very unnerved and off-put by Charlotte's actions.
No! This is a circus of pain! My eyes! They're burning! Oh, they're burning!
And guess what else? You're the main event! You get to shoot out of a circus cannon! Won't that be fun?
No! No more cannons! No more Charlottes!
But there's also small lines of dialogue that make you think a little bit more because, like, for example, in one of the first episodes, there's this song that Charlotte sings that goes,
Swing, 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 set, swing me to the moon. I can't breathe there, so bring me back real soon.
which honestly is kind of catchy. Even like years after viewing it, it just plays in my head sometimes. But that gets a different context when we get to the episode that talks about her parents, which supposedly went on a trip to the moon.
You're so lucky. I wish my parents could be here.
Why? Where are your parents?
They're in a better place. Up there.
Were they eaten by bears?
Hee hee. No, silly. They're living on a space station. Right. A space station. They're astronauts. I'm sure they'll be back from their mission very soon with lots of stories to tell.
So it gives us the impression that Charlotte the entire time is thinking about her parents and the possibility of them being up on the moon. But she does seem completely aware of the dangers of going to space. Specifically with the line, "I can't breathe there, so bring me back real soon." Another thing is that during the entire duration of the show, Marion was actually trying to find a way out of Clamberg. But that's usually us viewing the characters and interpreting it as the episodes go along with different context. And in the short that we're talking about, the different views are so far polarizing and exaggerating that, as I said earlier, it's kind of hard to tell exactly what happened. Because with Vendetta, she overplays the terror that Charlotte brings upon her, whereas Charlotte kind of seems to pretend that she's playing along, which would give off the impression that she is in some kind of delusion, as many people have theorized, especially since it seems to push the narrative that she doesn't know any better. But does she really? Now, most would kind of place Charlotte in some kind of psychosis or detachment, to which she's not only unaware of the danger that she's in, but she's also not entirely comprehending the horrors that are happening around her. But it also makes her very interesting because we as the audience understand this detachment, and for little kids, they might find it very endearing, but for adults, we might be thinking, is this child okay? And is there a therapist in Clamberg to help her? However, after watching that short and a very particular moment, there are a few things that don't add up to that theory. More particularly with this scene.
Vendetta has so many great pets. I taught some of them to swim. They are so good at holding their breath.
She drowned my Fiends!
Which is a huge red flag, which may cause you to take a double take. Which does put into perspective that yes, her actions can and will hurt other people around her. But one thing that stands out about that in particular is that drowning is a form of suffocation, and she seems more than aware of death as a concept and what causes it. Not only that, but she emphasizes they are so good at holding their breath. Which other small details she doesn't seem to emphasize that much. But if she was aware of suffocation as a concept, then she would be completely aware that they died. But the most alarming part to take away from this is that yes, her actions do have consequences for other people. But also she references death quite often in the series.
No! Why don't you pretend to be dead?
Okay.
I'd better. My life depends on it.
Yippee! Ooh, it's the last thing on the list. Number 27. Destroy Charlotte. Hee-hee, that sounds easy enough. Maybe I could be attacked by wolverines. Or, how about if I was catapulted to the moon?
My budget won't...
I know! I could dress up like a fly. No, wait! Butterflies are prettier. I'll be a butterfly that gets hit by a piano.
Okay.
No! I am not a mommy! I just want to be rid of these pigeon fiends forever! Please! Make them go away! I am begging!
You're right. It's time for the babies to leave the nest and start making families of their own. Learn to fly, baby pigeons! Yippee!
No! What are you doing?
But also the notion of Charlotte being dumb or stupid would be completely untrue. She does show a certain level of maturity and intelligence surrounding certain topics. For example, she always seems to find a way to break and enter, which requires a lot of trial and error. And it also requires a lot of, thinking about how to do it. Such as when she was trying to figure out how to get the cat down from the sign that was spinning. But also, one thing that stands out from other kids her age is that she's completely aware of the depressing reality of dreams. She's incredibly aware of the depressing reality of jobs. Which normally when kids talk about jobs, normally there is a sense of euphoria or imaginative, exaggeration.
Why don't we pretend to be workers in a factory? I'll glue eyeballs onto dolls and you can check the quality. Why don't we pretend to be telemarketers? Yippee! We can sell long-distance plans and call and call and call. Let's pretend, it is fun to pretend. Let's pretend that this is fun.
But when she sings the song, she doesn't seem to be saying anything that's generally untrue. It's very mundane and very simple, a huge contrast to the way she usually behaves. But also, in that episode where she turns very small, she uses her intelligence to make a makeshift playground and to get around the classroom.
What is she doing?
I knoweth not, for she be small, nay higher than a steamed clam.
But also, another thing is the episode where she does make a fiend, in that episode where Vendetta was convinced that Charlotte might potentially be super evil. Which even Vendetta needs to look back at a recipe book. Whereas Charlotte just kind of throws things in and seems to already have an idea of what she wants to make. She's not just throwing things in there willy-nilly, she knows exactly what might happen. Which is kind of bizarre if you take into account that her grandma doesn't necessarily have a book on that in the library. They're mostly baking books. In fact, she even displays, not understanding exactly what's going on with the fiend when she makes a comment that it needs more sugar in the bowl, which shows that Charlotte has knowledge that's separate from her family. There's even some moments where she seems to break character that, you may not think too much of it in passing, but if you observe the way she talks or the way she moves, you'll notice it.
Here we follow the triangle of tastiness.
Oh, yay! What's that?
To be rid of these pigeon fiends forever! Please! Make them go away! I am begging!
Where'd you go? Don't worry, you can still do everything on this list. I'll help you! It'll be fun! This pretty picture of Vendetta! But why is there an ugly red line through her face? So, you're going to play with Marion instead of me? Ooh! What a pretty drawing of an escape submarine! Let's show it to Vendetta!
There are certain points of the dialogue where her tone will shift, or certain cues or expressions that show that she is aware entirely of what's happening. And there's a lot of her actions that's specifically targeted towards Vendetta, rather than anyone else in her classroom. Notice how she doesn't go out of her way to bug other people unless they seem to be intertwined with Vendetta in some way. And for the majority of people, there's no evidence to suggest that Charlotte is at all malicious. But is that necessarily true? I don't see a lot of people talking about this, or people talking about the show in general, but let's just ignore that. But after watching that short and I went to rewatch the series, I did kind of notice a few things that kind of stood out. One thing in particular being the vegetables episode, which the premise of that episode is basically Charlotte trying to convince her friend Vendetta to eat vegetables because she's concerned about her health, which on the surface doesn't sound like a very malicious thing to do, but she does go through progressively worse steps to do so. Like at first, she suggests it. The next, she tries to deprive her of her usual clams, grape punch, and jerky. And then the next one was concealment, which doesn't leave a lot of options open for decisions or choices. But there is another tactic she uses. Now, at the end, there's this huge musical part that seems out of nowhere if you weren't observing enough what she was doing. Because previously, before it cut away, everyone was running and screaming from the vegetables, and even Charlotte seemed a little bit unsure what to do. But then all of a sudden she tames them to sing a song, which seems random, but if you listen to the lyrics, it has a little bit of an ulterior motive.
Eat vegetables with every meal, or your lips will start to peel, and your eyebrows will fall out, and your feet will smell like trout.
It's not necessarily meant to be persuasive or passive about the concept. There's no room for any actual, facts or anything like that. Instead, it's derived off the eat vegetables or else narrative, targeting some very common insecurities that a lot of kids her age might have, such as, eyebrows falling off, feet smelling, things like that. But in order to go to such measures in the first place, she needs to be aware of how stubborn Vendetta is in the first place. Now, there are some times where she seems to play along with the idea that, hey, I knew you would love it. But there's also evidence to suggest that she's completely aware of Vendetta's cruel and often stubborn ways, which may be confusing to hear at first when whenever she seems to mimic Vendetta, she tends to be very, she tends to compliment her a lot. She tends to show her in a more positive light. But one episode in particular that does show that she's completely aware of Vendetta and her actions is the episode Marvin the Middle Manager. And the whole premise of the episode is that Vendetta realizes that, hey, I'm an overlord dictator. Why do I need to go to school?
Huh? No! What I am doing here? I am super powerful, and I am at school.
She's also worried about nobody taking care of the stuff that she usually does when she's present. And so she leaves it up to somebody who she deems as very manipulable, and that happens to be Marvin. Now, initially Charlotte did volunteer, but she wasn't picked at any point. However, regardless of Vendetta's wishes, she still inserts herself into this narrative, which people may think that it's because she just doesn't want Marvin to get hurt. But she seems less than concerned for her classmates as a whole. Not only with stuff happening around her and her not initially reacting, but when she carries out how to do Vendetta's work, she in no way tries to pacify it, and she in no way tries to help her classmates. If anything, she's even worse than Vendetta because the entire class is left injured after her presence. And in order for her to do that, she needs to be aware of just how cruel and elaborate Vendetta's tricks often are, which is not something that you would see in somebody who is not entirely aware. Now, as with any theory, there's stuff that might question it a little bit. And one thing is that, now if she is completely aware, then why was she see doing such reckless things in the toupee episode? Which you would be right, she seems to be doing a lot of more dangerous things than she typically does. Which there are two explanations. Either she was completely aware of Mr. Milk and his affiliation with the toupee, which is why she inserted herself in the narrative in the first place, and is progressively trying to make it hard. Or the other one is that simply she, in some way, kind of begs for it. A silent wish for death, but relying on her environment to do so. But why would we jump to that conclusion of all things? Well, there are a few reasons why. But it also brings up a simple question that's related to it. Just why is Charlotte doing all this? Well, it's very likely that she's going through a lot from her move from Vermont. She likely didn't have any friends given the first line of dialogue that her grandma gives, and she's also dealing with the loss of her parents. Which a lot of people would assume that her parents dying was a long time ago or long enough for her not to be affected, only until you realize that she's still a little kid. If she were to remember her parents that vividly, which is very likely that the reason to move was because her grandma felt that maybe she needed a new scene, a new change of place, and a new change of pace. Charlotte was left out of control for her situation, given her age and the circumstances that happened along with her parents. But it also gives a reason as to why she deliberately stops her shenanigans with Vendetta when these fake parents were put in place of them. But it's also the way that she says that Vendetta's super lucky to have parents that could even come over at all, regardless of their situation. She also appears very apathetic towards other students, but very empathetic towards animals. kittens and cats in particular. And she's entirely aware of how people address her as stupid or dumb, but instead of being upset, seems to like being addressed at all. So it's not that Charlotte's evil and has it out for vendetta, but she has a lack of control, and can find solace in the fact that she can manipulate her surroundings from an undesirable situation to something a little bit more positive, which is something she tends to do regardless of her situation. If she's put in danger, she'll always find a way to make a friend or to pacify the situation. But whenever something goes a little bit different, she has been shown previously to react in a separate way, usually being animated with a blank expression or her tone shifting. An entire tone shift being the episode where Vendetta makes friends with Marion, something that she was not expecting. But also, there's nothing to indicate that they have met previously. And if they did, there would have been a little bit more of a reaction, considering that the show does have a love for subtle details. She's just a troubled kid who relishes the fact that Vendetta is the only one who seems to entertain her shenanigans in even the slightest. It's not very positive, but it's something for her to hold on to. So if she's deprived of Vendetta, she's also deprived of the attention and control that she needs in her life. Which is also why that despite the fact that she's completely aware that it's an escape plan that Marion was making, she chooses to show it to Vendetta deliberately. And kids who are facing a lot of trouble, especially if they lose their parents or any huge source of attention, they do tend to go routes such as this. Now, there isn't a lot of episodes to go off of, and this was just something that's been kind of rotting in my brain for a while. But also because I haven't seen a lot of people talk about this series aside from why it got canceled and whatnot, which makes sense considering that there isn't a lot of material to go off of, but a lot of the theories that I have been seeing just seem kind of like out there, kind of like crazy what-if scenarios rather than, derived off of any actual substance, which I wanted to make a theory that seemed a little bit more realistic and a little bit more interesting to think about. Now, Amy Winfrey does tend to write things that have a little bit more of a psychological influence. For example, Amy specifically helped directed the episode The View from Halfway Down, which is from BoJack Horseman, which I love BoJack Horseman. I want to go over it, but I feel like it's already been overdone. And the whole thing about this channel is going over things that not a lot of people talk about in a series, or like a series that people don't talk about much in general. But from a writer's standpoint, it's not unlikely that there would be an episode later on addressing, a character that isn't as in-depthly talked about. It's not uncommon for shows back then to address a character that's usually happy and go like, what if their life isn't completely okay? But it's kind of hard to tell what the plans were since the show was canceled prematurely. Nickelodeon. And if you made it this far in the video, this actually was not the original theory. The original theory was to address that Charlotte's completely aware and is deliberately torturing Vendetta, but when I looked at the episodes and I did more analysis, it looked a lot deeper than that. So what was originally a very cynical and frankly hilarious premise became something a little bit more depressing but realistic in a sense. Now, I'm not saying realistic in a sense of realism. I said like realistic in a sense that cartoons can be sometimes with their character writing. But anyways, thank you so much for watching. I'm so sorry this took a while to come out. I was out of state for a little bit, and as I said in the beginning, I got kicked out of my previous apartment, and my current apartment's not like my current apartment isn't exactly cleaned up because I didn't unpack, because they expected me to move everything here for a month while they clear things out. But I also don't want to move everything again. But a lot of people seem to like the Homura statue that I had, and so I don't want to deprive you of her because I love her as well. So, also I do plan on doing a Madoka Magica video eventually. I just need to figure out something that not a lot of people talk about. But, here's your Homura fix. Close up here. Alright, goodbye.